This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
All right. We might make a start. All right, we'd like to welcome you to the third of the 2018 May Lectures. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, and pay my respect to their elders and families, past and present. The local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. So the May Lectures is about the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences showcasing some of our exciting work that's going on in the school. Just to foreshadow that next week we have Dr. Peter Cavall talking about is emotional stability, or it's cracked up to be. So that'll be certainly an interesting talk. And this week we have the pleasure of learning about what makes us smart, which hopefully means we'll all leave a little bit smarter than we came in. This is by Amy Purfors, who's Associate Professor and leading research in the field of cognition, social reasoning and also complex data. She has a PhD from MIT in 2008. She spent 9 years at the University of Adelaide, won't hold that against her, and now is the Deputy Director of the Complex Human Data Hub here in the school. Amy's work focuses on higher order cognition, such as categorisation, concepts, language acquisition and evolution, decision making and social learning and transmission. Amy uses mathematical and computational models to study these factors and understand how they shape human behaviour. She's also an editor at Cognitive Science, has won many prestigious grants from the ARC and industry, and published award-winning papers in top-tier journals. Amy's also been a school teacher in Mozambique. She taught in Portuguese, and is also an accomplished women's rugby player. Some surprises you might not have known about. Most of all, Amy has a unique ability to connect her deep knowledge and technical research prowess to current topics. And I think that tonight's talk will be an excellent example of that. So if you would help me to welcome Amy. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Brock. As always with these introductions, you sit there thinking, who is this person he's talking about? They sound very awesome. I hope I can live up to it. So when I was asked to give a May lecture, I started thinking about basically my research career. And as Brock mentioned, I'm very interested in cognitive science, that is how people think. But the way I do it is by using computational models, that is trying to build computers that think like people. So if you do this sort of thing, it is unavoidable that you end up thinking a lot about the sort of counter to people, which is machines and computers, and learning a lot about what makes computer intelligence. So I thought it might be really interesting to talk about what I've learned over the course of my career about the comparison between artificial and human intelligence, and in particular, what that comparison reveals about us. Because I think that's not something that you often see making it into the public dialogue on these issues. So before I go on, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the work I'll be talking about relies not just on myself, but many collaborators, in particular Daniel Navarro, Keith Ransom, and Patrick Shafto. And also a lot of my thought has been shaped by a recent article that came out in Behavioral and Brain Sciences written by my PhD advisor at MIT. So if you're interested further, I suggest you read that article. All right, so let's set the scene and think about early artificial intelligence research. And if I had to come up with 2 words to characterize what that was about, I would say it was misplaced optimism. That's probably a nice way of characterizing it. So you have all these quotes of famous early artificial intelligence researchers, this was sort of over 50 years ago, saying, machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do. Or, from 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being, said in 1967. And I'm not trying to pick on these people. These are actually, some of the leading researchers. This was the prevailing viewpoint of the time. And I think it came from a radical misunderstanding of the complexity of the problems that human intelligence solves all the time. So obviously, those things did not happen. And what we saw was that computers tended to be very good at a few things. Generally, they're super good at crunching numbers really, really fast, which leads to them being good at things like solving or acting in very prescribed, very well-defined problems. So a computer can beat you in tic-tac-toe, right? Because everything is all preset. You know exactly, there's only a certain space of moves, and it's very well-defined. What computers were never good at, and especially this became very obvious in the 70s and 80s and so forth, is that they were good at the things that we're good at. Not only adults are good at, but even toddlers are a lot better at a lot of things than computers. So toddlers can talk to each other. And moreover, they can talk to each other in really interesting ways, sort of where the words have very clear meanings. They can do wordplay. They can have freewheeling, meandering conversations that aren't about prescribed topics. They can play with words. These things computers definitely couldn't do back then and still really struggle with. Relatedly to this, children, adults, pretty much, most people are pretty good at theory of mind and figuring out what's going on in other people's head. Even people with autism who struggle a bit with this are generally a lot better than computers are. And, and this comes into play in most of the things we do, as you'll see later. So especially sort of situations like dealing with possible deception. This is actually one of the hardest cognitive tasks there is, I think. People are way better than computers. And toddlers, unfortunately, are as well. But it's also not just our intellect. So people and animals, for a long time, way better than machines at doing things like moving in complicated paths with obstacles where there wasn't a clear way to go, or playing games that aren't really well defined. So Go is an extremely complicated game. In a sense, it's predefined. You can only move the stones in certain ways, but it's an enormous space of possibilities, and computers for a long, long time struggled with that. So the conclusion for a while was, well, computers are kind of useful, but not intelligent. And indeed, if you asked an AI researcher, they would kind of avowedly refuse to discuss what was called strong AI, which is AI that is like people, because it was just, that's not what we're thinking about anymore. But then, the last few decades happened. And I would say the sort of first harbinger of what was going on was back in 1997, when you had this sort of computer, Deep Blue, beating the reigning world chess champion. It was very depressing for a lot of us. But you can still say, okay, chess is still a nice, well-defined problem. Yes, it's huge, but it's still the kind of thing computers are good and you can just do with lots of brute force computation. But then you get Roombas. This is funny, but this is actually quite a feat, right? This is not a very well-defined thing. All you do is set it on the ground and it can clean your room. And that was actually sort of a triumph of certain kinds of artificial intelligence. But then you get even more interesting. So here we have Mars missions, where basically this is an autonomous system. You set it on Mars. It's got difficult terrain. It has a mission. Yes, a circumscribed mission, but still, it has to figure out lots of things. Then we see self-driving cars. Occasionally, they don't work so well, but this is an extremely hard problem. Under many kinds of situations, lots of unpredictable conditions, unpredictable other people on the road, and these cars generally do way better than anyone, if you'd asked in the 80s, they would have said it was possible. And then you get things like, I don't know if you are familiar with the game show Jeopardy, which is like a quiz show, and this guy on the right, I don't know if you've can see what he wrote. He wrote, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords," as he was losing this game horribly. He basically had almost a year-long winning streak. He's by far the champion of this game. And performing well on this, you might think, well, this is just lookup of facts. But it actually, the questions are asked in such a way as to require a great deal of linguistic intelligence, wordplay, and that sort of thing. And then you get things like computers were able to play Go all of a sudden, much better than anyone had ever been able to do before. And then only a year later, they got a computer that could train itself and beat all previous versions of Go playing within a few days, and all humans. And beyond that, we have things like routinely, we have computer assistants that can respond to quite a variety of verbal commands. We have robots that can mimic most human motion. We can get computers that caption photos in an intelligent way, which is a complicated visual and linguistics task. We can get translations that aren't too hideous. So I've heard they're actually starting to use Google Translate in many cases in lieu of real translators, not in sort of the super fine diplomatic meeting translation stuff, but God forbid, but in many normal circumstances. So it's kind of natural to look at this and be like, oh my God, where is this going? Are computers going to overtake us? Are they going to be our overlords? And especially when you're coupled with sort of rising headlines all like this, like, we're irrational. I feel like as an American I can put this up. We're stupid. This is also something that you hear about more and more. And so I think if I have any one message for you, it is, I think these worries are a bit overblown. I think it's definitely true that computers are better than us in some ways, but we're better in others. And more importantly, for us as scientists, the ways we're better are really informative about how we think and the way our brain is set up. And that's kind of what I want to focus on here. So I'm going to have to unavoidably make a lot of generalizations about the state of AI and the state of all of cognition and human thought here. But I'll start with the first generalization about AI, which is obviously a huge area, encompasses what is often called machine learning. But I'm really going to focus on a certain kind of AI because that's where most of the recent advances have come from. They've come from something called neural networks, or in most cases, deep neural networks, so DNNs. And there's lots of these kinds. I'm really not going to go into all the differences between them, many of which I don't fully understand. The basic idea of any neural network, it's kind of modeled very, very loosely. The more loose, the more you look at it, but somewhat on the biology of the brain. So just as the brain has neurons, a neural network has kind of nodes that receive signals. And just as there are layers of neurons in our brain, there's layers of nodes. And what they are is they're trained, they get some input. I can't get the pointer to work. They get some input, they compute, they change their weights, and that gives them an output. And it's the weights of the node, just as it is the connections of the synapses that contain the knowledge. And then once you put lots of layers of these together, that's what makes them deep. They're not deep because they're awesome and insightful. They're deep just because they have a lot of layers. It was a really brilliant branding strategy there, though. Once you get a lot of those together, then you can get sort of really nice phenomena where the lower level sort of abstracts some very lower level phenomena that serves as inputs to the next level, which can sort of do increasingly more abstract reasoning. So that's the kind of AI that's been driving a lot of these advances. But it's really interesting because in cognitive science, we tend not to use them, even though they're modeled on the brain. And the reason for this, well, I'll go into the reasons later. But I want to sort of briefly outline the kinds of models that I tend to use, which are basically probabilistic models. And the basic idea here is that they are essentially models that do statistical reasoning. But what you build in is really rich theories about sort of the things that you're reasoning about. You have prior beliefs built in there. You have a space of hypotheses. And just to give you a little flavor of what that means, so here's a kind of situation you might make a cognitive model of. So suppose I come to you, I accost you in the street for some bizarre reason, and I say, see these dots here in this top sort of bit? So what kind of, you just see dots. And I said, what kind of thing do you think, where do you think the thing is that generated these data? And I show you three possibilities. One is the thing is very large, and that means that any dots within that blue circle can, would have generated a dot. The other possibility is, oh, here we go. The other possibility is that there's two different ones. The other possibility is that there's actually just lots and lots of little tiny pits. So maybe this is sort of, these are mines, and this is sort of the space that you might have found mines or whatever. And if I ask you this, most people would say, well, obviously it was something like this. Now, how are we doing that? Well, the idea of a Bayesian model would say that what we're doing is we're calculating the probability of different hypotheses about what generated the data, and we're doing it based on the data we see and our priors about which hypotheses. And so we have our priors tell us that all things being equal, we kind of want a simple hypothesis, but we do want something that fits the data pretty well. So this isn't very simple. This doesn't fit the data very well. We do this. That's the qualitative idea of these things. But you can do this with you can make models that reason in this way over really quite complicated theories. So for instance, there's a model out there of learning conceptual structure that you give it just data about things in the world, and it can learn that animals tend to be arranged taxonomically. If you're reasoning about Supreme Court justices, there's a line with the conservatives on one end and the liberals on the other. If you're reasoning about colors, it's probably a ring, and so forth. Okay? So as a rough comparison, deep neural networks, which is what most of the premier AI stuff are, they can be really amazing, as we've seen, but they have a lot of limitations, as I'll go into here. And the reason we don't use them in cognitive science, besides those limitations, is they're really hard to understand. You just have this mess of nodes. So if you actually want to understand what are people doing, what is this model doing, what's it learning, it's really hard to tell. In fact, there's a few people, researchers in AI, who are now trying to understand what their DNNs do by putting them in psychological experiments like people in order to figure out what their underlying representations are like. So if you want to understand people, you don't really want to use deep neural networks. And the other reason, I think, is that the mistakes that these networks make are not like people's too, in revealing ways, which I'll go into. Bayesian models are really often used to understand people because they let you build in these kinds of things like hypotheses, spaces, and priors, and then actually test which kinds of things map onto people's behavior. The reason they're not so often used in AI is they're really hard to scale. That is, it's really hard to get them to work very quickly and with a lot of data. And also, they just take a lot more work. I hope there's no AI people in here who would disagree with me. I mean, there's a lot of theory that goes into building the underlying hypothesis spaces and representations in these models. So when I say some deep neural networks have limitations, here's some of them. I think they're funny and revealing. So some of these, there's a great site called AIweirdness.com if you want to just check out. I took some of the ones that I find really funny from there. So here's a picture. Here's a DNN which is doing image tagging. So it's learned, it's been trained on a whole bunch of images of that people have labeled, and it's trying to come up with the labels of those images. Now see if you can figure out what's wrong with this. So here it says, this is a close-up of a hillside next to a rocky hill. Well, that looks good. Tags sheep. Are there any sheep in there? No. Ah, here, this tags sheep as well. No sheep at all. So it's kind of hallucinating sheep. But it doesn't just hallucinate sheep, it actually unhallucinates them sometimes as well. So here, I do not know why, but this farmer painted all their sheep orange. There's probably some farming reason for that. You give that to the neural network and it thinks they are orange flowers, not sheep. And people, assuming you're close enough, would not ever make that error. Or this is a more egregious example of the same thing. Here, left, a man is holding a dog, right? A woman is holding a dog. These are not dogs. And my one-year-old could have gotten this. So sometimes it's hallucinating sheep, sometimes it's unhallucinating sheep. And what's going on here is that deep neural networks, they're just picking up on overall image statistics. And what they've learned is, oh, you have lots of greenery and this kind of image statistics. There tend to often be sheep in those fields, so there's got to be sheep here, right? It doesn't actually understand anything about objects. And similarly, it has learned there's little random orange dots in a field. Those are probably going to be flowers. So it's not doing it doesn't have an actual theory. It's just doing statistical association of these things. These are some even better examples. So these are labels of pictures that no human would ever come up with. So here we have a Wild West scene with a person on a horse dragging a guy, an outlaw of some sort, right? So, and the computer says, oh, this is a woman riding a horse on a dirt road, which, yes, it is, but that seems like a really fundamental thing to miss. Here's an even worse one. Oh, this is an airplane parked on the tarmac, right? So there's an airplane. There is indeed a thing that might be a runway. It is not parked on the tarmac. No human would do this, right? Or here's some people just standing on a beach. Yes, they are. But again, not something people would do. And again, this is sort of revealing of the fact that the computer doesn't have these rich theories of what's going on. You know, why someone might be dragging someone, and this is the important thing about the scene. Or a knowledge of how, airplanes work, and that this is, in fact, a really disturbing sort of thing. Or a knowledge about hurricanes and weather, right? You see that also, that it's really fun, and you've probably seen, you can take neural networks and have them generate random things, right? And so here's one of generating some recipes. Please never make this. And you can see, there's no real understanding of what even a recipe is. Very, very bizarre sort of words here. I don't know what garnished meme is. I mean, this looks like something I might make. And again, it reveals basically, no actual understanding of what's going on. It's just learned, and I say just, it's actually impressive what you can do with the underlying statistics of things, but it's missing something, I think we would all agree. Sort of a little less hilariously, but I think very deeply interestingly, there's also this effect where we tend to think of AI as they're the really fast learners, and they can certainly solve mathematical equations way faster than us and do many things faster than us. But one thing that humans can do way faster than even the best AI is learn from just a few examples. So take a human, you say, I've invented an alphabet, here's one new letter in this alphabet. Now, any of you could probably do things like, immediately, I give you a lot of other letters, you could figure out which of the ones are meant to be examples of that one. You could also generate new examples of that one in ways that, another person would say, oh yeah, that's that one. And you could also abstract the motor movements that would make other kinds of letters in that alphabet. You can do that with one example. No AI could ever come close to that. And in this paper that I referred to at the beginning, they actually did that. They took people, gave them exactly this task, and then looked at sort of the classification errors of people on this. As you can see, it's quite low, less than 5% on sort of new letters. Here we have the deep neural networks. The best ones, they're not doing horribly, but they're doing much worse than people. This is the best Bayesian model, which is doing around as well as people. And this is a general sort of phenomenon. So another thing that sort of people do really well, even at the age of 1 or 2, is that you give them just a very, very little evidence, and they can generalize well. Sorry, actually, I got ahead of myself. We're not having 1-year-olds play video games. So I'll get into that. But this is another interesting demonstration. So they took a deep neural network and tried to train it to play this video game, which I've never played. Anyone here has ever played? It's a kind of standard 1983 video game. You have to bounce on these things and get to goals and sort of, I don't know, not get killed by this polar bear and stuff like that. And so the deep neural network researchers trained some deep neural networks on these video games, and indeed they got very, very good. So they got really good scores. This one did kind of crappily, but these other ones did pretty well. The interesting thing is you can take a human, first time off playing this video game, really, really good. And it attained it basically the point that the deep neural network did after about 400 games. So humans, and this is a person who's never played this game at all. And then you get some growth from there. So humans can learn very quickly and generalize very well. And this was the example I was thinking when I was talking about the 1-year-olds. You take a 1-year-old, or a 2-year-old, or a 4-year-old, or a human. My kids didn't hear that. All right. So you have them play. Just give them a new object. And, you might say, oh, this is a Koba. Let's play with this for a while. Or you might just not label it and just say, my uncle gave this to me. Go away. A month later, bring them in and just ask them, do you remember what the Koba is? And people are very good at remembering, just a month ago what that label is. And not only that, but generalizing it to figure out that similar looking things are going to be Kobas, right? I mean, and this in a way, this should not be surprising to you, right? People are very good. That's how you teach kids words, or not the only way, but kids learn words that way very well. But let's contrast with a deep neural network. So here's one of the state-of-the-art neural networks, systems for sort of learning image concepts, which is what they call them. So BERT, you need literally thousands of examples of each item for this network to get a sense of what a bird is. And then it makes bizarre generalizations as well, right? So it's learning something, but obviously in a way different to people. So where do these differences come from? So I'm going to argue that what cognitive science has revealed is that we as people, we have certain capabilities that basically enable us to build models and theories of the world. And some of those capabilities we're born with. Actually, all of these capabilities we're born with, we think. But what we're able to do is combine a lot of these innate sort of basic biases in a very interesting and compositional way. So take the sort of innate claims with a bit of a grain of salt, because it's, really, really very hard to take a newborn and figure out exactly what they're doing. But we do have a lot of evidence suggesting that, from a very, very early age, humans have very rich theories of physics, motion, causality, psychology, how other people think, and the ability to build compositional models of them, that is, bits and pieces and parts. And the best AI doesn't have any of this. So let me give you a little bit of evidence about what I mean about all those things. All right, when I talk about intuitive physics, I am not talking about sort of sitting down in secondary school and writing equations. Obviously, people aren't really good at that. What I mean is the ability to do things like this little boy is doing. Stand and walk, which is an enormously hard balance problem. Play tennis, balls coming at you, could land in any kind of way. You have to deal with this racket, which isn't your hand. And people are, have a lot of intuitive skills of understanding motion, and objects and solidity that enable us to do these things. So what kinds of basic skills am I talking about? Well, one of them is that even young infants think that objects are continuous. That does not seem very exciting. But, this is again, something that a lot of models, they don't come with in the same way people was. And so how do we know this? A lot of the research I'll be talking about that shows that infants know this or that. The basic paradigm for learning this is called the habituation paradigm. You take an infant in, you bore them to death, you just show them something until they get really bored. Infants can't do much, but they can get bored. And then you change things. And what you do is you measure their change in either looking or, I love this, sucking on a dummy. So you actually take a dummy, it's kind of wired up, you stick it in the infant's mouth. When something's exciting, they go, suck, 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 suck. And when it's not so exciting, suck, suck, or spit it out, right? And so you can look at differences in their interests and measure it by sort of rate of sucking on the dummy. And you can also do it with sort of looking. So what you do in an experiment like this is you take the infants, you come in, they have a box, and they just watch a rod moving back and forth, right? Now you take some of the infants, the box is removed, and this is what they see. Basically, they see the two parts are moving together, but that they are two parts. They're really surprised. Their sucking increases. Oh my God. You take other infants, and you pull back the box, and they see this. And this is not very surprising at all. Right? So what does this show? This suggests that they were expecting this to be happening. So they expect that even an object they can't see is continuous. And when you think about it, that actually provides a lot of information about how to figure out what the heck is going on in your visual world, right? Because a lot of times things get occluded. Similarly, infants expect motion to be continuous. So what you do is you take an infant, some infants, you show them a display like this, the rod goes here, nothing happens, and then a rod comes out from there. So in a sense, the motion was discontinuous, right? And they're much more surprised by this than something where the rod just seems to be going smoothly through. So again, they don't feel transportation, or like the Star Trek transporters where you just sort of disappear and then reappear somewhere. Doesn't seem to be in an infant's world. And they, even at an early age, have formed this theory. Innate or not, I don't know. They expect objects to remain in containers. So you take an infant, you sort of put a little thing in a container, shake it round, and then remove the container, and there's the object! Oh my God, what's in there? They're very surprised by this, but not if it stays in the container. Again, these seem kind of weirdly boring, but when you think about it, you need to have these fundamental bits of knowledge to be able to reason about events and situations you haven't been in. And similarly, they know objects require support. So they see something like, they're watching this stage, a hand comes out and puts an object on another, and then it goes away. And they're like, dude, that was not very interesting. But then, if you take one and it just puts it there and then it floats in the air, and that is very, very surprising, right? So they expect there to be support as well. And so these are the kinds of core principles that you can build into a model and then sort of test to see if that explains human inferences in more complicated situations. So here's a kind of situation I'm talking about that's more complicated. You can here's some different blocks of towers. And I'm just going to ask you, how likely are each of these to fall? So, presumably most of you would agree, this seems quite likely to fall, right? This one not so much, maybe this one a little, but... And indeed, that is what people do, and that is in fact what a model that has those basic sort of principles in there and a compositional way of combining them will predict. So you don't have to build in anything about towers per se, just those basic principles. All right? So that's the kind of thing that I mean when I say we have these intuitive notions of physics. I think the psychology gets more interesting, not just because I'm a psychologist, because I think this is what drives a lot of our abilities that computers still are nowhere close to. And again, they're things that come out early in childhood. So one of these things, again, I'm going to sort of stay with infancy because infants are really freaking amazing, is that even a baby will follow the gaze of something if it has a face or if it has a certain kind of interaction. So here's what you do. The experimenter, there's the infant in there, sucking on things. The experimenter plays with this object, or points this object, actually there's a curtain, so the object comes out on this rod, and one of two things can happen. Either the object, it's just like a little stuffed round thing, either it has a face, by which it means it just has two little round things arranged like eyes and a little nose, or it doesn't. It's still got the little round stones, but they're not arranged like a face. And either the experimenter makes it play contingent on what the infant is doing, as you would if you're trying to play with someone, or it just kind of randomly waves it around. And then you look at whether the infants follow the gaze of the object. So they follow where this dot is looking or the actual gaze. Now, why would you follow gaze? You do that if you think the object has kind of something going on in their mind, right? Gaze is indicative. Where someone is looking is indicative of what they're thinking about. And infants are really good at following gaze. The interesting thing is that they follow the gaze of, as long as it has a face, as long as it behaves contingently, but if it doesn't, they don't at all. So this indicates, I'm not sure what the actual psychological understanding is, but at least some very basic building blocks for building that understanding. So understanding, making a lot of assumptions about eyes, and this is just one experiment, but there's a lot suggesting that, from a very early age, people think eyes are special. We do a lot about following them. And we also make inferences from the sort of behavior, what's going on inside the brain of an animal. Similarly, I love this experiment. So they took, I think it was 14-month-olds, and they came in and they watched the experimenter. There's this weird object, this little light-up thing with a button. And the experimenter in one of the situations turned on the light, actually in both of them, they turned on the light with their head, which is a very strange thing, and 14-month-olds realize that, right? But in one of the situations, there was kind of a reason for that, right? The experimenter was cold, and they didn't want to take their hands out of their blanket, so they turned it on with their head. And the other, there's no apparent reason the experimenter did it, right? The experimenter is just a weirdo. And then they gave the object to the infants and saw what they did. Now, if the infants are just blindly imitating, then what you would expect is that they're going to always touch on the light with their own head. And if they're paying no attention to sort of what's gone in front of them, then they should use their hands, because that's what you always do. But what you find is in the hands-occupied condition, when they can explain away the bizarre behavior, they don't use their head. So they think, oh, the experimenter didn't use their hands because they had this blanket on, but there's no reason I need to turn on this light with my hands, so I won't. Whereas when the hands-free condition, where there's otherwise no explanation, they also use their head. Which is another, again, it's sort of, I'm using a lot of these studies as sort of one example of a whole raft of kind of experiments suggesting that even very young infants make inferences about other people's goals from their actions, using rather complicated logic. And indeed, they can make inferences about helpfulness as well and prefer helpful things over unhelpful things. So here's an experiment. They just see this little animation. Here's a little circle trying to make it up the hill. Oh, it's struggling. And then this yellow triangle comes and helps push it up, and hooray, and it bounces because it's happy, right? And then in the hinderer condition, he's trying to make it up the hill. And then this square zooms down and pushes him down the hill. And, you know, he rolls away sadly, okay? Now, I'm saying happy and sad. All these were shapes, right? So that was not, it was just actions. But yet you got sort of, very small children, basically, when asked, would you rather play with this one or this one, they want to play with this one, they didn't like what it did, it was upsetting, and so forth. So they're making really strong inferences about the nature of something, their helpfulness, just from their actions. Again, this is not something that, that a lot of AI, I think, can do at all. And of course, you can use these basic core principles to explain behavior in more complicated situations. So in this study, for instance, what they did is they took children and they gave them this bizarre new toy with a lot of weird things on it. So there are like 5 different causal things they could do with it, like a beep and a tug or whatever. And in one condition, the adult sort of came and said, here's my toy, look. And they show one of those things. In another condition, the adult came and accidentally showed one of those things, but it wasn't purposeful. And another that said, here you go. Now, if children are reasoning about what the adult is trying to do here, then you would think that in the condition where the adult was actively trying to help, that's an indication there's only one thing to do with it. Because if they're actively trying to help, why wouldn't they share multiples? And indeed, that's exactly what you get. If you look at children, how much they explore and what other causal things they find, in the pedagogical condition where the adult was trying to help, they pretty much stick with one. Whereas in the other ones, the children are much more likely to find more of the causes. Now, the interesting thing is if you take a computational model, you build in these assumptions, and it's actually quite complicated recursive reasoning about what the other person is trying to do and what they assume. But anyways, it can capture that behavior. So again, we've got a notion of the kind of complicated recursive inference that you have to be doing in order to perform this action. You can capture it in this kind of model, but I don't think, well, they didn't try to capture it in a deep neural network, but I'd be really surprised if you could. Similarly, children make inferences about trustworthiness. So if you take kids and you have them learn a label from someone who's always been accurate, like 100% of the time, they label, say, something known with that label, like they always know that this thing is called a phone, and then they have the kid try to learn something new from that person. Kids will believe those people. But if the person tends to be less and less accurate on known labels, kids will not tend to trust the new labels from them. Again, it seems very simple, but it's the kind of thing that in order to precisely capture, you need a model that's doing this sort of reasoning about the other person's knowledge and beliefs and goals, and it's quite a complicated set of reasoning. And so the model can capture that. The model can also capture what happens if you just tell someone tell the kids that someone's a liar. Neither the kids nor the model trust them. Kids tend to be a lot more trusting than our model if you don't tell them anything. But anyways. And this intuitive psychology, this notion of intuitive psychology is especially interesting, I think, because it doesn't just apply to tasks that we would think are about understanding others. So for instance, there's a very common research question of how people generalize new knowledge about categories. And one very, very typical finding is that, say I'm trying to tell you, I say, what the heck is this? A macaw? No, I'll just pretend it's a macaw. I say, macaws, they have xylophenol acid in their blood. And then I ask, do chimps have xylophenol acid in your blood? You're like, well, I guess if macaws do, sure. But then if I ask you, well, macaws do as well as gorillas, do chimps do? And you'll say, yeah, that's actually more likely that chimps will if there's two of these things. That is a very common phenomenon. So, and you notice what's happening here is that people are making a generalization. I haven't told you anything about chimps, but they're making a sensible generalization based on something you've told. Now, the weird thing is that it's not the case that simply always adding more premises does this. So sometimes people are less willing to generalize. So if I tell you tigers have xylophenol acid, do ferrets do? People think, probably not, but who knows? If I say tigers and lions do, they're much, much less likely to say that ferrets do. So in some circumstances, you're more likely. In some circumstances, you're less likely. What the heck is going on here? What we suggested is that basically this is probably not because of, at least anything fundamental about categorization. It's because what people are doing is they're trying to make inferences about why you're showing them those premises in the first place, right? And so if they presume I'm helpful for some reason, but people tend to assume that, then they would think, why on earth am I showing them a tiger and a lion if I want them to think that ferrets are likely? Like, wouldn't I show them something maybe a bit more like a ferret? Whereas in this, these things are both already like the ferret. So the idea is that people, if they assume that you are picking out informative exemplars, then you should generalize this way in this kind of case and the other way in the other. And indeed, we took people, we put them in this kind of situation where the targets are like this and the controls are like this. We varied the cover story where either they thought the person was being helpful or was just a random. And what you see is basically they generalized appropriately as you'd expect, just like this, if they thought the person was being helpful. But if they thought it was kind of a malfunctioning computer providing these examples, they didn't. And you can capture that with a model that, again, makes these assumptions. All right, I'm going to do one more because I think this sort of insight that people are using psychological reasoning all the time is really kind of a powerful insight to explaining a lot of behavior. So some of you may recognize this problem. This is the Linda problem, right? So I'm going to tell you about my friend Linda. Oh, she's single, outspoken, bright. She's sort of really interested in discrimination, whatever. And then I ask, which is more likely, that she's a feminist or that she's a feminist and a bank teller? Now, logically speaking, this is less probable. But if she were, then you'd have to ask, why did the description have nothing about those things? And so the idea, so this is, again, it's a common misunderstanding here. People will generally say Linda is a feminist. I think I got something wrong here. That doesn't make sense. Right. I messed that up somehow. Okay, let's skip over that because it is awesome, but I messed it up. All right. All right. So the last example of basically trying to show how people are using psychology comes in a lot of linguistic understanding. So you have often probably been in an experiment or in a situation, someone comes and says, God, I just went shopping and that kettle cost $1,000. I don't know, maybe you have. And you think, did that kettle really cost $1,000? And most people are not likely to think the kettle cost $1,000, right? This is probably figurative language. And what they really meant is that the kettle is expensive. But in order to understand that, in order to understand when figurative language is being used versus literal, you have to have a pretty complex understanding of the general prices of things, but also when people might exaggerate and why. And so what these people, this research did is it took people and it gave them all kinds of these situations, so the kettle cost $50 or $500 or $1,000 or whatever, and then looked at what they thought the answers were. So this is ranging from 50 to 1,000. You can see if people say 50, oh, they do think the kettle costs 50. But as the dollar amount grows increasingly large, people are less and less likely to think it is the actual dollar amount said. A few people think, okay, maybe a kettle could be $500, maybe it's like a super fancy kettle, but very few people think that a kettle is going to be $10,000. And a model that sort of builds in this kind of recursive sort of psychological reasoning can capture these things. Again, I'm not aware of any kinds of deep neural networks that could even get close to it. So we've got some pieces. We have some pieces of physics. We have some pieces of psychology. There's also some way that we know about how humans combine those pieces, and that is due to compositionality. And the idea of compositionality is that you just take pieces and they're in parts, and you can put them together in certain ways and not others. And this is something that neural networks don't easily, at least undifferentiated neural networks without a lot of structure built into the nodes and the weights, they can't really capture compositionality very well. But the idea is that our intuitive theories, the way we take these basic building blocks, is that we put them together in a certain way. So you see a new object, you don't just kind of calculate the image statistics over that object. You break it down into representations of parts, you map functions onto those parts, you already have some idea of functions, and this lets you generate new objects, right? That is basic theory building that people do, and a lot of the best AI, deep neural network models, don't really. And this is helpful in sort of parsing new images. So you guys are all here facing me. I'm not thinking undifferentiated massive mess. I'm thinking people, benches, exit in case I make another silly mistake. And those things are put together as parts. And this also comes through in a lot of language as well. Language is just not sort of this random stream of words, but we think that it has sort of phrase structure and structure of how the rules for how words can be combined. All right, so what's that mean? I started off meandering and talking about AI, and then I started talking about sort of infant sucking on things and lots of random experiments about people. What's the point here? I guess my main point is, relative to an AI, we have problems. We are slow, we get tired, we forget things. AIs don't really. But we also are much better in some ways. And the important thing for me is the reason we're better. That is, we have rich theories, strong intuitive concepts, and we can combine those. And what that does is that really lets us generalize from very few examples very, very easily. And it enables us to be far more flexible in a new situation, which of course the world is full of. So even the best AIs, that's where they really struggle. They can optimize for photos that involve sheep, but it's really hard to stretch beyond that. So I'm kind of going to end with a bit of, because I know this is where probably many people have questions of, well, what comes next? Not what comes next in my talk, but what comes next in the future, sort of where is AI going to go? Where are we going to go? To that, I could say definitively, I think if anything of the history of AI has shown us, it is the danger of making any predictions about what's going to happen. If I had to guess, I think that we will see a continued increase in the ability to do certain things using deep neural networks. They really show the power of basic statistical associations and computational power. But I think it's going to plateau below what people are capable of in exactly the domains I talked about. Learning flexibly in new situations from few examples. Now, am I willing to say that that's how it's going to be forever? No, probably not. I think probably what's going to happen is they're going to come up with very clever ways of combining the virtues of these kind of Bayesian models with deep neural networks, and then I give a double shrug. I have no idea. But I think also sort of more profoundly, I think a lot of what motivates this question is just this fear that we're going to write ourselves into irrelevancy. And I think that the fundamental point is that our value as humans does not necessarily derive by whether we're different or better than AIs. I mean, maybe there's some super intelligent alien out there. Finding that they exist is not going to make us more or less valuable than they once were. The same way for an AI. So I think it's interesting and informative to use them to study. There's a great deal of societal implications about what we do with these, but I don't think it means anything about sort of, whether we are valuable in ourselves. So that's it. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. I think Amy's happy to field those.
Right. Yeah.
There's a well-known method of testing human intelligence called IQ. Is there any such thing for deep neural networks?
That's a really good question. So the question was whether there's an equivalent for IQ for neural networks. I think, I'm getting a little sketchy here, I think they have tried to apply neural networks to some of the sort of typical IQ problems like Raven's matrices and so forth. To what effect, I don't know. But I don't think there's a... So the closest that I know of a test of IQ for a neural network would be like the Turing test, which is... So the Turing test is, you know, we'll know that AI has reached the pinnacle when a human can't tell that it's an AI. So it's just it's that kind of test. According to that test, you might argue that we're already there. I don't know if you guys saw the sort of new Google Assistant that can go and make reservations. You know, that sort of passed the Turing test, but it was in a very isolated, very prescribed domain. That's the only one I'm aware of, but I'm not, I could be missing something. Yeah. Yes?
You haven't mentioned anything about vocal, and I'm wondering, is there an intuitive grammatical, because many of the languages all have the same structure. Have you studied that at all?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. Part of the reason I didn't mention it is because it was hard to do justice in the amount of time I had, so I decided to abandon it entirely. I think, first of all, it's fairly contentious among linguists exactly how many of the properties of language are sort of innately driven or built out of anything other than sort of pure statistical reasoning. I tend to fall on the end of thinking that there are certain things that all humans have in common. Some of them are things like we have basic machinery to hear the sounds of language, the phonemes of language, and that probably comes from our mammalian auditory system more than anything. This compositionality gives our languages structure, and all human languages, as far as we can tell, have some kind of compositional structure, but the details vary a lot. And also our notions of what is important to talk about probably drives language structure as well. So most languages have nouns and verbs, probably because we care a lot about objects and actions. And there's probably a lot that also comes out because of the process and dynamics of transmission. So I think, yeah, basically the answer is it's super complicated. But a lot of the best AI, linguistic AIs, like, say, just Google, you know, that's pretty much... obviously, I don't know exactly how Google works because they don't open source all their stuff. But I think probably the vast majority of it is just sort of pure statistical learning, which words tend to follow which other words, with probably a bit more complexity in there, but nothing like the sort of complexity of human grammar, at least in the same way. Obviously, in some sense, it's way more complex because Google has memorized, you know, strings of 14-word combinations and things that no human's doing. Yes, way back there.
I was wondering, with the deep neural networks, is it possible that in the future we could combine that with flexible learning, so the computational functionalities of the AI, which it does better than humans, can we combine those two together?
So I think it's totally possible in the sense, well, first of all, because, you know, I think in principle there's no problem with, our brains are clearly doing something similar. But also they are all fundamentally computer code. Now the problem with, I think the thing that makes it very, very difficult, first of all, is that these kinds of Bayesian structured computational models are very computationally expensive. But secondly, we don't know actually what the neural networks are doing, so figuring out how to hook them in would require understanding what the neural networks are doing better. So I think it's possible, and I'm sure, you know, and I think some of the very interesting work starts to do that in certain ways, like they'll have a giant neural network doing something and then the inputs might go into a more structured model. Like I think some, again, we're treading on ground that I'm not entirely sure, but I think some of the sort of, you know, visual, some work in visual machine perception and stuff starts to do that. But I think it's fundamentally difficult. And right now, it's very easy to build a giant neural network and just train it up and see what happens. So I suspect to the next at least 5 to 10 years, we're just going to see a lot of that and see how far that takes us. Yeah?
So my question is related to the previous question in terms of that deep neural network can be amazing, but it's hard to understand. And there is an emerging research in transparency and trying to explain what the system's doing. I'm not familiar with Bayesian, but I'm just wondering how does Bayesian use reasoning, and if using Bayesian model also has some issues in terms of lack of transparency.
So the question was whether sort of Bayesian models have any problems in terms of lack of transparency as well. And I would say they have very few problems. In fact, that's kind of why I like them, because what you have to do is you have to put everything in explicitly, right? So you are making all the decisions about what the theories are, what the computation is, how long it's running, like all these things, and then you can sort of, and most of these things map onto, intuitive psychological folk theories. So, in the example with the little dots, the theories were just areas where the dot is, right? And I can put in this giant space of what those areas could be. I know exactly what they are. I can get the computer to print out at any one moment what it thinks about that. I can make different assumptions about how far it's searching and so forth. So it doesn't have that problem with lack of transparency. That's also partly why, it takes them a long time. It doesn't scale as well. So there is a trade-off, but yeah. Yeah.
Is it possible that deep learning is something that people do but in a very specific task? So deep learning, although it doesn't replicate everything that humans do, in very specialized ways, it is very good at predicting in the same way that humans do. For example, in Go, it was that expert intuition, right, that AlphaGo was very good at approximating.
Yes. So the question was whether humans are like deep neural networks in some ways. And I did kind of gloss over this because it wasn't as cool of a hook. But I think we certainly are. So one thing, what deep neural networks do, again, they're just doing lots of statistical association number crunching, more or less. That's a vast oversimplification. But people are pretty good at that too. So for instance, you have learned a lot of implicit statistical associations about things like, what the kind of age distribution of people in this room is. Or, if I give you a lot of random objects and there's kind of a statistical pattern in them, you will figure that out. We are actually really good implicit statistical learners. Not as good as deep neural networks, but pretty good. And I think we're doing some of that. So I think, humans are probably something like Bayesian models combined with these kind of, statistical learners in some way that we don't know yet. Yeah. Yes?
What do you think about trying to dissociate, especially for deep neural networks, the capacity to be able to learn something versus the inputs that you've given it in order to learn that thing? Because it seems to me like in quite a lot of the examples, it's not really an even playing field. You're saying that like a person, as soon as they play this video game, they can get it. But it's like that person's probably seen other video games. And even if they haven't seen other video games, they've seen other videos. And even if they haven't seen other videos, they've been a human for however many years. Which involves all of those things that you're talking about with those babies. And you say like, oh, well, the neural network required 100 pictures of birds to be able to choose birds. But even a very young child, you go to the zoo, you've got binocular vision, you see the bird from like many different angles, so even if it's the same bird, you've got like really probably millions of images of birds to compare it to. And so do you think that, and again, when you're using the Bayesian model, you're telling it what you think it needs to know in terms of prior assumptions. Do you think that if you gave neural networks, if you sort of looked at the comparable Bayesian model, and you thought about the inputs that you had given it, and if you gave the neural network like an organic kind of version of those inputs, do you think it would be able to integrate all of that stuff together and perform more like a Bayesian model?
So that is a very, very good question. I hope you all heard it because I can't recap. Yeah. And I think there's actually two parts of it. One is, could we take a neural network, give it the kinds of inputs in the Bayesian model, and would it do something sensible? And the second is, could we take a neural network and give it something like the input that a person has over their whole life, and would it do something sensible? So the first one, could we take a neural network, give it the kinds of inputs we do in a Bayesian model, would it do something sensible? Now, this is a speculation because I haven't actually tried to do this, but I am pretty sure that what would happen is it would do much better, because part of my claim is that it is these inputs that come from our sort of our intuitive notions of physics and psychology that are carrying a lot of the work. Unless you also explicitly structured the network to be able to compositionally combine those in the right way, I don't think it would be quite like people. And once you did that, then it would basically be a different kind of implementation of that exact Bayesian model. Now, the really interesting and totally speculative question is the other one, which is if you just took a neural network and gave it all the real input that people get, and that is in some ways much more rich than what these have, would it be able to abstract out these fundamental intuitive notions of physics and psychology and so forth? To that, I just don't know. I would suspect that it needs to get a little more structured than that, in that some of these intuitive notions of, say, continuity and stuff, they might not be totally learnable from the input, but this goes down to the sort of the question of how much do we have as a newborn versus how much of this have they learned over the course of the first years of life? You know, we don't really know. You know, they seem to learn it as early as we can test it, but, you know, I can't get a newborn to do much of anything, and neither can these researchers, you know. So it's really hard to tell, and I don't really know yet. Sorry, I'm going to ask someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Yeah.
My question probably a bit off topic, more general ones. Often we think that someone is smart if they know a lot of facts and like have a good memory as well. And we know that now we can Google everything, or we can put a GPS and get us to address. So we don't really need to memorize as many things as we used to memorize before. Do you think it's actually make us smart in a way that we can get all this information combined, or more stupid in a way that we don't need to memorize all this stuff anymore and we can use machine for it?
So
is it
yeah.
helping us or not?
So that's a really interesting question. I think that there's a lot of consensus that in addition to the human mind, a lot of the things that gives humans our power is our basically rich cultural knowledge. So even before we had Google, we had books that we could write things in. We invented writing. I mean, heck, language itself may be a kind of cultural tool for passing on information, so we didn't always have to learn it anew. And so I think that Google and computers is sort of an extension of that, maybe the most powerful extension of that yet, but it is another way that we are taking jobs out of our head and putting them on the world. And so I think that in some ways we're being stupider because we don't have to do that, in the same way that, you know, we don't need to memorize entire texts in order to be able to, you know, share books with each other the way they had to do thousands of years ago. So in a way, that's stupider, but in a way, you know, it's just requiring us to develop other skills. So people now, we need to be a lot better at sorting through masses of conflicting information. And frankly, that's actually quite difficult. You know, and in a way that we didn't have to be as much when we weren't faced with so many masses of conflicting information. So I think it just develops different skills. All right, how much time do we have, Paul? All right, I'll ask, okay, a few more, go ahead. Yeah.
What did we learn about intelligence by studying artificial intelligence?
What did we learn about?
Like biological intelligence, or human, or plants one, or animal one, I don't know.
Well, I think so. I think if I had to sum up what we have learned about intelligence in general from artificial intelligence is how many bits it has to it. So it is not just a matter, I just realized I called you Paul, Brock. I have no idea why. Were I in artificial intelligence, I would not have made that mistake. I think what we've learned is that intelligence is not just a matter of throw more computation power at something and it will automatically get there. There's a lot of structure to what we know, and it's not sort of a simple more brain cells equals smarter. I don't know. That's probably my single summary. There's probably a lot hidden in there. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
One of the things that I think, in answer to what you were saying before about modelling Bayesian models within a computer, the difference between that and a human is always going to be the way way the human can pick up something else that wasn't built into that model and see it like that. So we had a 2-year-old when we were in England, and he was very good at cars, recognising cars. We were in the town, and somebody had taken a Renault 4, cut the top off, painted it with stripes like a zebra, with nothing right. And he said, oh, that looks a bit like a Renault 4. Now, I don't reckon there's any compute, like what would you put into a computer that could possibly give that kind of output? So picking up something really critical about.
So I think there's nothing now that can do that. I think that there's no logical reason in principle that that sort of thing is impossible. And I think the direction to go to try to do that is exactly not understanding just the primitives, you know, the basic intuitive notions that we bring to, say, the problem of tower falling, but the entire toolkit of intuitive notions that we have that we bring to everything. And probably what's going on is that, you know, your 2-year-old is making links between those things that have not been built into any model yet. But in principle, I don't think there's a reason that it couldn't. I don't think we're like some magical substance. Yeah, but that's probably what it would take, if I had to guess. This is all a very speculative talk. I hope you guys realize. Yeah. Yeah, yes.
I don't know, I assume you heard about the Facebook bot shutdown thing that was over dramatized. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about machines learning to speak to each other.
So I'm not sure what you're talking about. When you said Facebook, I was thinking you were talking about the Cambridge Analytical thing, but that's not what you're, no, this is,
bots, that were intended to talk to people started talking to each other.
Yeah.
And, some alarmists made it out like it was a doomsday matrix type.
So I haven't heard of that particular thing, but I know that, you know, I've seen there's actually some somewhat hilarious demonstrations of that sort of thing happening before. I think that is actually a really interesting thing that might happen more and more. As you get more AIs sort of going out and doing things for us, there will be more AI with other AI interactions. And a lot of the way these things are trained, you know, they kind of, especially most recently, they're trained, these things called adversarial networks. They basically take these networks and they train them against each other, and this network tries to fool that one, and that one tries to fool that one, and that makes them learn much faster. And so I think you might get some runaway weird effects happening where they sort of respond and learn from each other. I'm not sure that'll lead to an adversarial doomsday scenario. I think it's much more likely to lead to, you know, random weirdness. But yeah, I think you might get sort of, you know, things that we can't predict by virtue of those things happening out in the world a lot. Yes?
I'm going back to the Linda problem that you mentioned. That humans are inherently have biases, like the work of Dan Kahneman on. So is the way the trend of Bayesian networks are going to, if created an artificial intelligence, are they going to kind of scaffold and eliminate those biases that we have, like the bank teller? You know, most people kind of give the idea that a bank teller and a feminist, which is less likely, but people tend to choose that. So is the Bayesian model going to choose the other one, which is less likely?
Yeah, so I regret that I screwed up in making my slides because I think, so I guess I have two answers to your thing. So in the Linda example, the actual Linda example is that it was written so that it sounded like she was both a feminist and a bank teller. People say, yeah, she's a feminist and a bank teller, even though strictly speaking that's less probable than feminist alone. And what we showed, and we had a model doing this, that basically if you're reasoning about why someone's telling you this, then it's actually quite a sensible inference to make that she's a feminist and a bank teller, because otherwise why would you be telling her things like she really likes accounting and so forth, as well as she has feminist traits. But as soon as you don't do that, as soon as you're not reasoning about the goals and motivations of the other person, then strictly speaking, you know, it isn't a correct inference to make. And people don't, once you put them in a situation where they don't. So I think the short version of it is that I think that a lot of these Bayesian models, the power of them is that you can put in assumptions about the other people, and in fact, not just you put in, but you just put in the machinery to make inferences about those assumptions. So we're not telling the model this person's helpful. We're telling it sort of think about whether this person's helpful or not, you know, and you have certain priors. More broadly speaking, I think where a lot of really interesting work in Bayesian models is going is that that they're really useful for trying to explain what's going on when otherwise potentially maladaptive biases occur. So something like that is a great example of, it might not be actually that stupid, we're reasoning about psychology, but you can also do things like you can take a Bayesian model that's performing in some sort of optimum or correct way, and you can basically just give it limited reasoning cycles, so it just has a limited memory, or you can make it drop things, and you can show that certain biases fall out of that. So I think that's a very interesting direction to go, and that's where a lot of the research is heading. Yes. Yeah.
Like the individual skills come from genetics or your environment shape?
Right, so the question is, where do our intuitive notions come from, genetics or environment? I don't know. I mean, I think both. Like, that's not very interesting, but, you know, like, you can't take a chimp and teach them to do things that people are doing. Like, clearly genetics matters somewhat. But I would suspect that if you took a person and you put them, I mean, and we know, if you raise people in really environmentally constrained conditions, they do not, you know, they come out with severe problems as well. So, I mean, both, but the interesting thing is how and in what way, and, you know, that is the topic of a lifetime of research and not a 2-minute answer. Yeah. Yes?
Just kind of going off of that, I was just wondering if you saw the articles that came out about the snails, the memory being transferred, and if you think that maybe applies to if we infer that babies have been born with something, if that's how that happens.
I actually did not hear about the snails and the memory being transferred, but, so I assume you mean epigenetically, is that?
I'm not exactly sure how, but it was something with I think they extracted some sort of cells and put it in the other snail, and they like trained the first snail to react to pain, and then they transferred the cells into the second
Right.
snail, and the snail reacted as if it had been trained.
So that is fascinating. I am not prepared to speculate. I mean, yeah. Yeah. All right. I think that, yeah.
Give you a rest, maybe.
All right. Thank you. Those are a great set of questions.